In this video, we're going to talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act violations that occurred in 2023. So the first thing I wanted to do is draw attention to the top 10 industries that were reported. And what I did is I looked at the entire year, and when the Department of Labor would disclose this information publicly on their website, I would track the type of company, the back wages owed, the liquidated damages, and the percentage of it as well was kind of formulated. But on top of that, I also was tracking the actual violation itself that occurred, which we'll detail in just a few slides. But basically, what I did here is I provided a pretty detailed look at exactly what industries were affected the most. So believe it or not, employees that were in the restaurant industry saw the highest amount of wages paid back to them, with over $27 million recovered in 2023 alone. They were the top industry that received back wages and liquidated damages, and that accounted for over 21% of the total back wages owed to employees in 2023. Second place was manufacturing, coming in at 23 million plus and over 17.5%. Home health was number three, had over $18 million in total wages paid back to employees, which accounted for almost 15%. And then a pretty steep drop between home health and distribution and logistics. So in a distribution and logistics company or companies accounted for almost 6.5 million and then almost 5% in total wages recovered out of all of 2023. Adult long-term care. So that's, adult long-term care facilities or even companies that had that type of, adult long-term care services. They owed pretty much just a couple of $100,000 less, so very close with distribution and logistics. The next one was the automotive industry, came in with over $5 million in back wages paid, 4.3%. Construction companies came in with 4.7 million, almost 3.65%. Grocery stores, they came in with about $3.8 million in back wages recovered, and of course, 2.96%. Plumbing, it's kind of odd if you see plumbing listed here because you're thinking, well, what if it's an independent contractor plumber? That's not the case. It's, that independent contractor could be one or it could be many. And it just so happened that this one made up several industries, of course, and they accounted for over 3.3 million in total wages due and 2.53%. And then last place on the top 10 was insurance. An insurance company owed their employees over $3.3 million in back wages and made up almost 2.52%. So as you can see, quite a substantial amount of money that was recovered in 2023 alone. But it's worth noting that when an employee calls the Department of Labor and tells them that they haven't been paid appropriately, it triggers an investigation. And one of the things that I discovered when I started my company last year, I called the Department of Labor and asked them if an employer finds out that they violated these particular situations and they found these violations themselves and they self-corrected, will they have to pay liquidated damages? And the Department of Labor here in the state of Louisiana answered no. They said no, the employer would not have to pay liquidated damages. So in other words, the incentive here is almost a more than 50%, it's close to 50% wages that are paid back to them. So if you make a mistake in payroll and you don't pay your people appropriately, but you discover it, you just owe them the back wages. But if you don't discover this on your own and an employee goes and reports this to the Department of Labor and triggers an investigation, you not only owe the back wages, but you also owe the liquidated damages as well. So as you can see, it's quite a substantial number, but over $131 million has been recovered in back wages and liquidated damages. So what we want to do now is we want to kind of talk through some of the information in terms of where did these things take place. So one of the other things I did was track the actual instance. So when the violation came across, I checked off if it was any one of these situations. And I pulled the top five industries that occurred with this, the top most, the five that had the most violations, of course. So, an employer or employers that paid sub-minimum wage, there were a total of 59 incidents that occurred with that. And as you can see, restaurants led the way with 24, construction, hospitality, home health, and security services, but a clear uh, definition that restaurants had a substantial amount of violations, more than likely and almost more than 50% of what was listed here. So it's a pretty substantial. If you're in the restaurant industry, this is definitely something you need to keep in mind. And sub minimum wage means that you're paying under minimum wage. When you don't pay people their tips, typically that person is going to be paid sub minimum wage in some way, shape, or form. Denied or underpaid overtime. So meaning these restaurants or these home health agencies or construction or whoever had this happen, they paid straight time for all hours worked, or they didn't pay the person the appropriate overtime rate. So typically they pay them straight time, or they just didn't pay them at all and they only paid them 40 hours. So quite a substantial situation, and even if they misclassified them, that results in denied and underpaid overtime. There were over 219 incidents with this in 2023, and as you can see, restaurants came right up again in first place. Home health was second place, construction, healthcare, and then residential contractor. Now, there's no other industry that really pays tips besides restaurants. I'm sure you can find them in other places, but it's typically only in restaurants. And of course, 31 restaurants in total had an issue with withheld tips. So, not a small number by any means. It's definitely more than two a month for sure that were caught with this type of situation. And withheld tips usually results in unpaid overtime because you're not paying the person the appropriate overtime and sometimes not even paying them the appropriate minimum wage. Illegal deductions. There were a total of 18 violations in 2023 for illegal deductions. And this could be for things like deducting for uniforms, and 9 times out of 10, it's for uniform deductions. Sometimes it could be for other things like damaged equipment or something else. And what it does is it's considered an illegal deduction when it brings the person under minimum wage. So if you have a tipped employee that has to pay for a $300 uniform and they're only paid 725 an hour, and you just happen to deduct it from their pay when they're not paid well over minimum wage in your state, that could result in this type of violation. And of course, that means you're paying them under minimum wage, and of course, in some instances, not even paying them the appropriate overtime rates. But restaurants led with that, security services, adult long-term care, agricultural, and then distribution and logistics. So those were the industries that were in the top five. Auto deduction of meal break. This is something that I've spoken on in the past before, where I'm not a big fan of auto deducted meal breaks. The reason why I don't care for them too much is if the employer doesn't have a sound policy around it or doesn't have a clear methodology to how to handle it. Sometimes employees don't report it the way that they're supposed to, or managers don't fix it the way that they're supposed to, or payroll doesn't fix it the way they're supposed to. So auto-deducted meal break means that, hey, if you work 4 hours, we're going to deduct an hour from your pay, and you're just going to get, 1 hour deducted from the total hours that you work. You see it primarily in healthcare industries, and that's where I've usually seen it. I know at one of the hospitals I worked at, they did it there with the RNs because they were on the floor the entire time, and they never really had a standard lunch break, and it kind of varied all over the place. But 12 of those incidents arised in 2023. Healthcare, as you can see, adult long-term care, very similar. Grocery store, security services, and construction. FLSA misclassification. So this came in a couple of different ways. This means that they either exempted the person, meaning that they put the person in an exempt level role, even though the person's duties were considered non-exempt, and that person was due overtime, and they were not paid overtime. So FLSA misclassification resulted in unpaid overtime, and in some instances, even below minimum wage. And on top of that, there are some of these industries that also made them contractors. It's hard to believe that you would go work for a company and they would make you a contractor. But again, there's a clear definition between a W-2 employee and a 1099 contractor, and it typically goes in span of control, or who makes the decisions. So, in other words, if you are just following that employer's direction, you should be considered a W-2 employee. And especially if you're not providing the equipment and you're not subject to loss, you're typically a W-2 employee. 56 of those incidents arised in 2023. Restaurants happen to be one of the main ones. We tend to see this with back of house staff. When I say back of house, we usually mean chefs, people that are servers, or even in some instances, dishwashers, or people that are considered non-exempt based on their duties and even the wage amount. It's kind of a two-part test, where when you claim exempt, that person has to make a certain level of the salary threshold, the minimum weekly number salary threshold, and they have to have exempt level duties. And in most cases, most restaurant employees don't have that happen to where they actually are exempt. So 11 violations occurred with restaurants, home health, security services, construction, and healthcare. Um, it's pretty simple that if you're working for a construction company, you come in and they're like, hey, you're going to be considered a contractor. It really depends. If you're going in and installing it in the house and you're going through the whole methodology and you're using your own equipment and all that, then yes, you probably will be a contractor. But if you're using their equipment, their tools, you're doing it based on their direction, and you're not really subject to loss in any way because they're paying for the materials themselves and you're just going to report to them, you're considered a W-2 employee in most instances. And then, of course, healthcare right at the bottom. Failure to keep accurate records. So there's a multitude of records that an employer needs to hold on to for so many years. Very standard stuff like name, birth date, social security number, the work hours, their paycheck stubs, and timesheets, and all these things for up to a 2 to 3 year period, even after termination. There were over 100 instances of this that occurred, and restaurants led the way with failure to keep accurate records. This also results when they didn't have any timesheets. They weren't tracking their hours. They weren't doing this because they didn't have the systems in place. So, believe it or not, even in this day of technology, there are still employers that are doing things on paper. And I worked for an employer not that long ago, over 7 years ago, that was literally using paper timesheets and time clocks where you dropped a piece of paper in and literally punched the clock to put a punch stamp on the timesheet. So restaurants led the way with 32 of those incidents. Home health, and then we have healthcare, residential contractor, which is saying they're contractors or residential contractors, and then of course construction. So an interesting situation that in these industries specifically that they had failure to keep accurate records. And of course, falsified records. This is typically when the Department of Labor will charge additional damages called civil money penalties when an employer goes through and actually does something willful. Falsified records, there were 15 incidents of that, and that's pretty serious when they do that because typically that means somebody's going in and making changes or inappropriately removing or redacting data. And that's a very serious situation that can result in a substantial amount of money that's recovered. So, with that being said, there were 15 incidents that occurred with falsified records. Restaurants led the way. Then you have adult long-term care, and then the rest of the ones listed there had just one violation, but still, one is more than you would want in this case. So, from a comparison standpoint, there were a total of 510 violations that occurred this year, or excuse me, in 2023. And based on the type of company, restaurants were almost near 50%. They were so close to it. Of the total violations, they made up 173 of the total violations accounted for. So, not a small number by any means. Home health, construction, healthcare, adult long-term care, security services, residential contractor, grocery store, hospitality, distribution, and logistics, they all kind of followed behind. But as you can see, restaurants really, really led the way with the most amount of violations. It's hard to kind of shut your eyes to that because if you're a restaurant employer or in home health, you have to pay particular close attention. And honestly, home health, healthcare, and adult long-term care, those are so close that you almost can add those together. And if you did, you would be, clearly substantially close to 90. So you wouldn't be too far behind, but, definitely a winner here with restaurants. So if we compare the wages owed versus the number of violations, you can see that, um, there's a pretty clear comparison here that, uh, this results in quite a bit. So the more violations you have results in the more amount of wages that you have to pay. So that correlation is pretty clear with restaurants. Home health, why it came in with the total number of violations, didn't have as much, and back wages do. And manufacturing is nowhere on this list in the top 10. So you can kind of tell that, hey, that means they had a very small number of violations that resulted in a tremendous amount of money paid back. So it might have only been a handful versus any one of these other higher numbers. Home health had the third most paid out in wages, and they were number two in the number of violations. So clearly, there is a definite or correlation between if you have more violations, that usually results in more back wages recovered. So I just want to thank you so very much for watching this. I hope you guys have learned quite a bit from me. And looking at this data, I'm going to do the same thing for 2024. It's really interesting to look at this data and kind of have an opportunity to show it to you, but also give you some pointers on what those areas are and what industries had the worst situations occur last year. So if you found some benefit to this video, I would really appreciate it if you smash the like button and the subscribe button. I'm always trying to provide value content for you guys, and I won't stop. I'm going to continue doing that as we go forward in 2024. But again, I appreciate your support. Thank you so much for your participation. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.